Commentary on the fourth tractate of the first Ennead of Plotinus. In this tractate, Plotinus is concerned with what is called a Greek eudaimonia. There is no accurate translation of this word in English. Happiness is hardly adequate, but Armstrong perhaps comes closer, though even more abstractly, by calling it well-being. Essentially, well-being indicates an individual state of fulfillment, of living up to one's fullest capacity. Each school of philosophy offered a different basis for well-being. For the Peripatetics of Aristotle's school, it is living a life of virtue, but also enjoying certain additional external goods. The Stoics believed that well-being came from a rational life lived in virtue only, entirely independent of any external circumstance. And the basis for the Epicureans was that they deemed the right balance of pleasure. Plotinus begins by reviewing these different notions of well-being, and objects to each of them, though he dismisses Epicureanism with little thought. Once again, Plotinus comes close to identifying with Stoic ethics, but with strong criticisms aimed at Stoic physics. Whereas the Stoics view reason as something of the highest order, for Plotinus, reason is a means to an even greater end, ultimately leading up to the good, which lies above reason itself. Again, it is best to visualize the location of well-being. That is, essentially, in what part of the hierarchy of the human being does it pertain to? Plotinus does not identify well-being with the bare being alive. Rather, it is rooted in something ontologically higher than life itself. Thus, the basis of well-being is not measurable in quantitative terms, but in a unique difference of quality. If mere being alive is insufficient, if well-being demands fullness of life, and exists therefore where nothing is lacking of all that belongs to the idea of life, then well-being can exist only in a being that lives fully. And such a one will possess not merely the good, but the supreme good. If, that is to say, in the realm of existence the supreme good can be no other than the authentically living, no other than life in its greatest plenitude. Life in which the good is present as something essential, not as something brought in from without. A life needing no foreign substance called in from a foreign realm, as in matter, to establish it as a good. Such a life is one which is integrated with the good itself, and thus it is a soul integrated within herself. It is not something added quantitatively to the soul, but an alteration in the quality of the soul as it ascends higher toward the good. For what could be added to the fullest life to make it the best life? Seneca similarly expressed this qualitative difference. Those who reckon life by number, or by measure, or by parts, rob it of its distinctive quality. Now, in the happy life, what is the distinctive quality? It is its fullness. Well-being is a goodness which is itself a reflection of the good itself. Just as the absolute good requires no external thing in order to be itself, so the human being in a state of well-being requires no external thing. To the human being in this state of well-being, what is the good? He himself by what he has and is. What indeed could he be seeking? Certainly none of the less worthy things, and the best he carries always within him. He that has such a life as this has all he needs in life. Once the person is a sage, the means of well-being, the way to good, are within, for nothing is good that lies outside him. At this point, Plotinus' language echoes very closely the virtuous exhortations of the Stoics. And, like many Stoics, he spends the next few chapters of this tractate dealing with the same objections to the notion of an individual's well-being not being dependent upon external bodily conditions, the miseries of Priam. Read out of context, without Plotinus' larger metaphysical framework, these chapters closely resemble Stoic ethical discourse. But the purpose of bodily detachment is not merely to protect oneself from the blows of misfortune. It is a means of liberating oneself through a universal perspective, All these schools called for a kind of self-duplication in which the I refuses to be conflated with his desires and appetites, takes up a distance from the objects of its desires, and becomes aware of its power to become detached from them. It thus ruses from a partial and particular vision to a universal perspective, be it of nature or that of spirit. Whereas for the Stoics, detachment itself was the goal of the philosopher. For Plotinus, asceticism was intended, above all, to stop the lower part of the soul from diverting toward itself the intention which should be oriented toward the spirit, that is, the life of contemplation in noetic mind. By the 9th chapter, however, Plotinus takes a new turn. The question arises if one can be unconscious of his own well-being. Can one be in a state of well-being and remain unaware of it? For Plotinus, well-being is rooted in the good itself, and therefore the connection of well-being is not through discursive reason, but through higher noetic reason, which ontologically precedes discursive thought. For Plotinus, it is not a matter of being aware of well-being or not, nor of even possessing it or not. By virtue of already participating in the good as soul, one already has well-being potentially. It is merely a matter of activating it within oneself. The coherent soul is one which is ontologically integrated within itself, and also with the good insofar as capable. Well-being depends upon the orientation of the soul toward the good. Evading the good by looking downward, so to speak, toward the material world, can only lead to dependence upon that which can only bring further inner disintegration, leading to a disorderly and incoherent soul. The domain of well-being thus lies not in the body, but the upper soul. It would be absurd to think that well-being begins and ends with the living body. Well-being is the possession of the good of life. It is centered therefore in soul. It is an act of the soul, and not of all the soul at that, for it is certainly not the characteristic of the vegetative soul, the soul of growth, that would at once connect it with the body. There must be a sort of counter-pressure in the other direction, towards the noblest. Concern for the body must be lessened, reduced, that the veritable man may show forth, the man behind the appearances. Once again, Plotinus echoes Stoic ethics, but with an ontological difference which effectively frees consciousness from the material world toward an even greater cosmic vision of the whole. The philosopher thus remains a member of another order. To be sure, the body should be cared for, but only within the limited context of having an instrumental purpose for a greater goal for the soul itself. The midpoint of the soul always represents a choice. In which direction should we travel? Toward further inner disintegration and disunity, or toward greater integration and the unity of the good? Well-being does not depend upon the body, which lies below the soul, but upon the good, above the soul, from which the soul is given its own being. Nevertheless, the body has its uses in the soul's ascent toward the good. According to Porphyry's chronological listing of the Enneads, this tractate on well-being was the last one Plotinus wrote as he lay upon his deathbed, racked with pain. And despite his affliction, he wrote these final words imbued with gratitude, imagining the body as a harp, and the singing voice the soul. When the harp fails him, he will change it, or will give up harp and harping, as having another craft now, one that needs no harp. And then he will let it rest unregarded at his side while he sings on without an instrument. But it was not idly that the instrument was given him in the beginning. He has found it useful until now, many a time.